in 74, but I can tell you that it is an extremely interesting book.
Sorry, everyone. I think we just lost Professor Kevin Nell. I think he said he was just going to have to switch over from the load shedding to the normal power at the offices at JBS. So we're just waiting for him to join us again. Please be patient with us. Thank you very much for attending. We are just waiting for Professor Nell to join again, then we'll start again. I see he's joining now, then we'll get back into the seminar. Apologies for the delay. It's just some load shedding technical issues, as we're all gotten used to that at this time. Okay.
Fred, can you hear me?
Yes, Prof. I can see you're back. You're back.
I have no idea what happened. I just went offline. Maybe it is the Wi-Fi. Let me try again.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Yes.
Right. So. Right. So you can all see this, and I'm still online, I think.
Yes, yes, you are.
Okay.
Yes. Thanks, Prof.
So I don't know where I lost you, so I'll start again. Yeah, so the title of the presentation and also the paper that I'm working on is Inflation and Growth in Developing Economies, a tribute to Professor Thirlwell. As I mentioned before, I mean, so the tribute is based on this very interesting book that he published in 1974, and you can see this is the front cover of the book, and the book is entitled Inflation, Saving and Growth in Developing Economies. And I don't know if you got that, but I said the front cover looks a little bit dull, but the book is extremely interesting. So don't be deceived by the front cover of the book. Right. So, yeah, you know, what do I do here? The purpose of this paper is to pay tribute to Professor Thirlwell's major contributions in growth and development economics. So perhaps as many of you know, I mean, Professor Thirlwell is basically more of a non-mainstream economist, and he likes to refer to himself as an unreconstructed Keynesian. So he's not post-Keynesian, he's not a new Keynesian, unreconstructed, very pure. And he's made major contributions in, shall we call it, non-mainstream macroeconomics in the Kaldorian tradition, as you can see there. And he's probably better known, rather than the inflation growth story, for his work on balance of payments constrained growth. He published the seminal paper in 1979. He's got a very popular growth and development economics textbook, which is reached its 10th edition in 2017. So that's Professor Thirlwell. So the paper on which this presentation is based, if everything goes according to plan, will appear in a special issue organized by the editors of a journal called Investigación Económica in October 2023. So to give you a bit of background, I mean, I first met Professor Thirlwell in October 1979 as one of his PhD students at the University of Kent at Canterbury in the United Kingdom. Now, before that, I mean, you know, before I met him, I was a very young and inexperienced lecturer at the University of Fort Hare. And I'd come across his fascinating book, the one that I showed you, Inflation, Saving and Growth in Developing Economies. At the University of Fort Hare, we had a very understocked library at that stage, which maybe there was a blessing in disguise because his book stood out among, you know, the 10 others that we had at that stage, way back. And I came across his book and I really found it a fascinating read where, you know, he really promotes some mild inflation as a way to develop in underdeveloped countries. And yeah, so, and after, when I completed my PhD, we became close friends as well, and also collaborated on a few research papers published in 2017 and 2018. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to provide a review of his book, as I mentioned before, Inflation, Saving and Growth. So hereafter, I'll just refer to it as ISGD, as you can see there, just to abbreviate that. And I mean, when you look at, the book was published in 1974, some of the major insights of that book, I feel, have largely gone unnoticed when you look at surveys and empirical studies that have been published since the early 90s. And I cite a few of them there, as you can see. And, the main message of the book is that mild inflation could be beneficial for growth in developing economies. And you'll see that's not the only thing. There are several other things. And when we put everything together, all the stuff he said in 74, you see how important that is to interpret the more recent evidence. And, the recent papers and so on have completely ignored his main contribution. And I try and set the record straight in this paper. Yeah, so let's have a look. And I mean, I do mention this in the paper. The reasons why ISGD has gone under the radar a little bit when you look at more recent studies. You've got to remember that it was published in 1974 when many developing countries experienced important, with the first oil price shock, sharp increase in inflation. But then when Thirlwell wrote the book, I mean, it was based on research on observations he saw in the 50s and 60s, where many developing countries inflated at a very slow rate. I mean, developing countries outside non-Latin American countries recorded an average inflation rate of 2 to 3%. And his book is all about, over that period, he felt that central banks were too conservative. And if they implemented slightly more expansionary monetary and fiscal policy measures, they could stimulate development through inflation. But of course, the timing wasn't great. And there's a great, excellent book review by Cobb, who commends Thirlwell for his kind of bold, daring approach to development. I mean, mild inflation to stimulate development, that's kind of unheard of. We always just hear how bad inflation is for growth. But also mentioned that it was published at a rather inopportune time. The timing wasn't great for the first oil price. So everyone's worried about inflation. You're not really paying attention to the main message in the book, which is mild inflation to stimulate growth. And then also the reason why it's gone under the radar a little bit is because, us economists, we're kind of infamous for our short memories. We quickly forget, and something that was published before with great insights, some time passes and we forget about that. So one thing, I mean, obviously the book, the main message is that mild inflation can stimulate growth, but in no way does the book neglect the importance of structural and cost push inflation. So that's very important, like the first oil price shock, that's cost push inflation. The key message in the book is that the growth benefits of a little bit of inflation will come from demand side, expansionary monetary and fiscal policy. It will not come from cost inflation. The other type of inflation, structural inflation, is more the inevitable outcome of the growth and development process. So that's very important, an important message of the book, to distinguish between different types of inflation and what type of inflation will actually stimulate growth. It's all about demand plan. You see, this is very important to interpret the more recent evidence, as you will see later on. So you will see the ISGD, which he wrote, way back, it predicts that inflation thresholds, because of structural and cost push inflation, should be higher in developing countries than developed countries. So we can look at that prediction and look at the more recent evidence and have a look and see. And basically, as you will see, my selective survey of studies since the early 1990s, they support Thirlwell's key predictions made almost 50 years ago. So what are the policy implications? I'll discuss that later. What are the open economy implications? Because if you go for inflationary finance of development, there could be open economy constraints that may thwart your policy of inflationary finance. So we've also got to take that into account. So, to see the policy implications, the open economy implications, I mean, go and have a look at the book and go and check out my paper, because I discuss that in more detail. So first of all, I mean, I already talked about structural inflation. So what I want to do here is just to show you this monetary structuralist debate. There was a heated debate in the 50s and 60s. That debate is just as relevant in today's developing economies and even in our advanced economies today. So I want to make that point in this section. And this debate, in turn, provides key insights to interpret the results since the early 90s on inflation and growth. You will see. So that's emphasized in Thirlwell's book. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And it's very important to know what the debate is about so that you can interpret the more recent evidence in a policy relevant way. And I'm going to argue in favor of a structuralist approach, as you will see, relative to the monetarist approach. So the monetarist approach, I mean, Milton Friedman is basically seen as the father of monetarism, and Anna Swatch, his co-author in some of their famous books, 63, 82, she's basically seen as the mother of monetarism. And what is monetarism all about? It's all about several assumptions. The money supply is under the direct control of the central bank through the central bank's control of the monetary base. The underlying cause of inflation is excess demand relative to fixed supply, and supply is fixed to demand. So whatever you do to demand, supply will just remain there. Supply is determined by something else. And inflation is the cause of the excessive monetary expansion that generates excess demand and inflation. That's the monetary story in a nutshell. Now, in contrast to that, you have the post-Keynesian structuralist school, where they assume the money supply is not exogenous, it's endogenous. So central banks and commercial banks, they tend to accommodate the demand for bank credit. Money supply endogeneity doesn't mean the central bank cannot affect the money supply, but they tend to accommodate that to preserve the liquidity of the financial system, to avoid high unemployment rates, and so on. Now, a key element of the structuralists, now compare that to the monetarists, is that supply adjusts very slowly to demand due to several rigidities in the economic system. So it's not because there's a supply constraint, like in the orthodox view, it's supply is rigid. Supply adjusts, but it's slow to adjust. And because it's slow to adjust, you have inflation. And therefore, you have several, in structuralist writings, several structural sources of inflation that have been emphasized. The dispersion of demand between submarkets, foreign exchange bottlenecks, an inelastic tax system, and an underdeveloped agricultural sector. I don't want to go through all of them. You can go and check out the paper. But to give you an idea what structural inflation is about, let us start with the first one, dispersion of demand between submarkets, and you will see what I mean. Dispersion of demand between submarkets is in the development process. You have expanding sectors and you have declining sectors. And in the expanding sectors, you have high demand, wages and prices will increase. But if wages and prices are rigid downwards in the declining sectors, then overall inflation will increase. So the process of development will be accompanied by inflation, and especially if labor and capital are immobile, they don't move easily and quickly from the declining sector to the expanding sector. But you need that process to continue, because eventually price and wage signals, labor and capital will be allocated in an efficient way, and inflation will actually be squeezed out of the system later on. But you cannot intervene prematurely by implementing restrictive monetary policy when you think it's demand pull, but it isn't. The same thing about the underdeveloped agricultural sector. In the process of development, you're industrializing. What will happen when you're industrializing? You're urbanizing, there will be a rising demand for food. The agricultural sector in an underdeveloped country is a bit underdeveloped. Food prices will go up, wages will go up, and you have a wage price spiral, and the inflationary process will become self-perpetuating. So with a lot of the structural sources of inflation, the recommendation is that you should allow it to develop. You shouldn't try and implement restrictive monetary and fiscal policy measures. So monetarists typically, they go for zero inflation or inflation rate that is very close to zero. Yeah, that's the typical story about Friedman, Swatch, and others. Monetarists, post-Keynesian and structuralists, in contrast, they basically saying you should allow for high inflation thresholds because of structural inflation, and that's the kind of inevitable outcome of the growth and development process. So there's a big difference between the two schools of thought, as you can see. So in more recent times, remember, I'm trying to say, trying to argue why this is a very important debate in developing countries today. But in more recent times, 2022 to 2023, in response to inflation from the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine, you know that central banks in advanced countries, they've kind of reacted by increasing their monetary policy rates, and trying to stem that type of inflation through restrictive demand management policies. But the underlying cause of inflation is not demand pull, it's perhaps more structural and cost push, isn't it, rather than demand pull. So you have this very interesting issue in Review of Keynesian Economics, published in 2023, where they look at this issue, and most of the contributors there that have been rigidities in the transport sector, but you need to allow that inflation to go, and that will give price signals. Wages, labor and capital will then move in the right direction, and inflation will be squeezed out of the system. If you're going to go and intervene as a central bank, you're not allowing the process to run its normal course. Cost inflation, high energy prices and food prices from the war in Ukraine. Well, I mean, you're not going to solve that through demand management policy. You're going to create a recession, and maybe inflation will, and you will not be able to affect the inflation rate. And to back that up, I also quote another study by Bhattacharya and Jain, 2020, and published in Economic Modeling. And they look at the kind of the same issue. It's a very interesting paper, where they look at the monetary policy responses of advanced countries, how they responded to an increase in food inflation. And what they show is central banks, in response to food inflation, they increased their monetary policy rates, but that didn't reduce overall inflation. That increased overall inflation, because the disinflationary effect of restrictive demand management policies was offset by an increase in production costs. So you can see the dangers of overly conservative monetary policy measures when the underlying cause of inflation is not demand pull. Emerging market economies, in that same study, there's no monetary policy transmission mechanism, and my guess is perhaps in emerging market economies, the central banks adopted less aggressive monetary policy stance in reaction to food inflation. We're back to the structuralist interpretation. Restrictive monetary policy will not help to alleviate cost push and structural inflation. So you can see the monetary structuralist debate is just as relevant in present day economies as way back when we had that heated debate in the 50s and 60s. So empirical support, when we look at the empirical evidence, which view does it support? And I'm basically saying the empirical evidence kind of supports the post-Keynesian structuralist view, primarily because when you look at studies, they tend to show that the money supply is endogenously determined. A very interesting study by Vera et al. 2022. They present their own results, but they also provide an extensive review of studies in developing countries. So, it's not like the monetarist view where the money supply is exogenously determined. Then you also want to know, when you look at what are the underlying causes of inflation, and I cite a few studies in low-income African countries where they tend to show that the underlying causes are structural and cost inflation. They dominate in low-income African countries relative to monetary factors, the monetarist view, and also even my own study for an emerging market economy like South Africa. It's basically structural cost inflation, not monetary factors. So overall, I see the evidence as providing stronger support for post-Keynesian structuralist view. So you will see how important that debate is and how important it is to interpret the more recent evidence on inflation and growth later on. So let's have a look. So structural inflation is the inevitable outcome of the growth and development process. Thurwell's ISGD book, as I said before, the growth benefits must come from demand inflation. And so structural inflation, and to a lesser extent cost inflation, is part of the growth. It's the price that you pay for faster growth, but you shouldn't intervene by implementing restrictive monetary policy. It won't happen, won't help. And so Thirlwell's ISGD book provides a really comprehensive overview of models that predict some of the benefits of mild inflation, which must come from the demand side. But he basically emphasizes two models in particular. The first one is the Caldwell-Thirlwell model of forced saving, which I'll discuss very briefly. And then the second one is the inflation tax model, where you get some benefits from mild inflation, and it's about demand inflation. So let me quickly go through some of those models. Have a look at the Caldwell-Thirlwell model. Nicholas Caldwell is also a very well-known post-Keynesian economist, published this paper in 55, 56, and Thirlwell in 74, and a few papers elaborated on that. But what the model is really about is like, expansionary monetary policy to finance development. Let's say that occurs in a specific economy. That will generate, cause plans to invest to exceed plans to save, because, private entrepreneurs, they want to invest will exceed plans to save. What will happen when you have this excess demand in the product market? The inflation rate will increase and real wages will fall. And that will cause a redistribution of income from wage earners to profit earners. And then the model assumes that profit earners have higher saving propensities. And as you can see there, the aggregate saving ratio will increase. So in a nutshell, what the model predicts, inflation finances business fixed investment and growth in this way. And I can just quickly mention this way of doing it and relying on inflation. ISG sees that as a better way than relying on foreign capital inflows. Finance development from domestic resources rather than borrowing in foreign capital markets. So there are also several criticisms against this model. So in this paper, I provide an elaborate discussion. I won't elaborate too much on that here. But one of the main criticisms is the assumption of the model that there's money illusion on behalf of wage earners. So the model assumes that wages will increase proportionately less than an increase in inflation, and that will cause real wages to fall, and you have redistribution of income from wage earners to profit earners. If the wage price coefficient is 1, you don't have any money illusion and the model won't work. So there's this debate, and Woodfield and McDonald and Johnson mentioned it, that this money illusion assumption, the wage price coefficient is less than 1, is only relevant in the very short run, because wage earners will later on, when their real wages keep on falling, they will resist it. And so in the long run, the wage price coefficient will tend to unity. Thirlwell answers them, and I look at that debate by saying, well, you've got to remember, it's not only about the effect of inflation on nominal wages. Wages are also determined by other factors as well, like efficiency wages linked to productivity. And when you put all of them together, my real wage may fall because of inflation, but it may increase because of other factors as well. And in actual fact, the redistribution of income from wage earners to profit earners is completely compatible with an increase in real wages. So there will be less resistance from wage earners, and the wage price coefficient will not only be less than unity in the short run, but perhaps also in the long run, so supporting the model. Then the other criticism, and I'll briefly, is one by Fitzgerald in 2006, and he developed wage price models that basically exhibit explosive behavior, and he's basically saying, well, the instability properties of these models imply that the Caldwell-Thirlwell model is only relevant in the short run, and I'm quite critical of that view, because the Caldwell-Thirlwell model, Fitzgerald's story, it's explosive because it implies increasing inflation rates. The Caldwell-Thirlwell model is not about increasing inflation rates, it's about a one-off increase in the inflation, one-off, to stimulate development. So that criticism really doesn't hold. So the verdict is, the Caldwell-Thirlwell model remains useful to examine the growth benefits of mild inflation. The model, what you're trying to do is consistent with a fall in structural unemployment. That's the main advantage in capital scarce developing countries, because you may have unemployment. It's not because of deficient demand, but it's because of the lack of cooperating factors like capital. And this model, because inflation generates a faster rate of capital, it may also reduce structural unemployment. And it does have some affinity with a very interesting model developed by Akerlof et al. In 1996. George Akerlof, as you probably well know, is the Nobel Prize winner in economics in 2001, where they motivate non-zero inflation up until 4% based on, sort of Akerlof's model. And there are some similarities between Akerlof's model and the Kaldor-Thirlwell model, and it's also supported by Krugman. So I'll discuss all this in detail in the paper, and I'll leave it at that. The second way in which mild inflation can stimulate growth and development is through the inflation tax model. So this is also one that's emphasized in ISGD. The main premise here is that typically in underdeveloped economies, tax revenue is inelastic with respect to income. And there are also large administrative costs in tax collection. So those are the issues that you have in a typical underdeveloped country. And then the assumption is also that there are many productive infrastructure projects, R&D activities with very high social returns, but with low private returns because private entrepreneurs cannot capture all the benefits themselves. And that gives a very important role to the government to supply these investment goods, productive infrastructure, electricity, water supply, domestic transport, and so on. So you have this, but you don't have enough revenue to finance that because of the inelastic nature of the tax system. So government's plans to invest will exceed the plans to save. They don't have enough normal tax revenue to finance these productive investment projects because of structural rigidity in the tax system. Alternatively, what you can do, instead of collecting taxes in the normal way, you can impose an inflation tax that can supplement normal tax revenue. And I can show it to you here. I mean, you can see that this is the inflation tax model. And that was originally, it originates from the quantity theory approach, which is really a monetarist approach. And it was developed originally by Kagan and Bailey 56. And Friedman, ironically, also made some major contributions. He wrote a very interesting paper in 71. But remember, this is all about inflation. And based on Friedman's previous work, he's really inflation averse. So even in that paper, even though he makes a point, he still qualifies, he still doesn't think inflation is necessary. You don't have to revert to inflation. So I would say structuralists and Keynesians has grabbed more onto this monetarist way of doing it rather than the monetarists themselves. But what you can see very, very quickly is that I'll quickly explain the model. On the vertical axis, as you can see here, you have the opportunity cost of holding money. So R is the rate of return of physical capital, and P is the inflation rate. Yes. So if you assume initially that you have a zero rate of inflation, then R, the opportunity cost of money holders, you will be at point A, will hold M divided by P subscript 1 money balances. Now, let's say, for example, to finance the budget deficit, government's plans to invest in excess of plans to save. The central bank expands the money supply. It's a money finance deficit. What will happen based on the quantity theory approach? Inflation will increase from 0 to P1, as you can see there. And the demand for real money balances will fall to M divided by P subscript 2. So what is the inflation tax? The inflation tax is the tax rate, which is the inflation rate P1, multiplied by the tax base, which is M divided by P subscript 2. And that's the shaded area, which will then give you the real yield from the inflation tax that can be used for investment purposes. So you can get around the rigidities in the tax system by just reverting to an inflation tax. I also review in this paper studies that have, and especially important papers by Tanzi that have been published after Thirlwell's 74 book, because that's also important. He qualifies the amount of revenue you can get from an inflation tax, and you should take that into account in a developing country if you want to do that. So he emphasizes the importance of lags in tax collection. So the problem there is that you've got to have a look at your normal tax revenue. Now, typically, the money value of that normal tax revenue does not increase in the same proportion as the inflation rate. So when you have inflation, the real value of normal tax revenue will tend to fall. And whatever you get from the inflation tax, that may be offset, the shaded area, by a fall in normal tax revenue. And if you have long delays in tax collection, that will keep on eroding normal tax revenue. So what I say in the paper for developing countries, what they should really do is they have, shall we call it an advantage, they have a very low normal tax revenue to GDP ratio, which emphasizes the importance of inflation tax. But they should then try and avoid long delays in tax collection. So when you generate an inflation, it doesn't erode your normal tax revenue and then kind of offset your total revenue that you get. So that's another point I make. And then just to show you how relevant this still is, shall we call it modern day economies, this model, this money finance deficit story, which is the inflation tax, has gained popularity in recent years. You can use a money deficit, finance deficit to mitigate, recessions like the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, COVID pandemic, large government expenditures. Rather revert to this than a debt finance deficit, because a debt finance deficit will involve interest payments and future debt obligations. And that's a more effective way to generate demand. This model, however, is not only for recessions, it's for normal circumstances in underdeveloped countries where they struggle to collect tax revenue through, conventional ways. Then the open economy implications. Now, the call for inflationary finance, is that compatible? And this is the question I'm asking, with Thirlwell's seminal paper in 79. He published the book in 74, then he published a really important paper in 79, based on balance of payments constrained growth. So when you see BPC, it's balance of payments constrained growth. And when you look at it first, say there's a contradiction. So let me quickly show you very briefly what the balance of payments constrained growth rate is. He develops this model. So you can see GB, that's the balance of payments constrained growth rate, and that is equal to the growth of exports, which is equal to the income elasticity of demand for exports multiplied by world income growth divided by the income elasticity of demand for imports. And the model predicts that economies' actual growth rate will be equal to the balance of payments constrained growth rate. That's what the model is about. Now, if you want to implement inflationary finance, expansionary monetary fiscal policy, what's going to happen is that the growth of demand will exceed the balance of payments constrained growth rate. Yeah. So that doesn't in any way imply, because in these models, they're more Keynesian, so demand creates its own supply. You're doing that. But the problem is that your growth rate exceeds the balance of payments constrained growth rate. What that means is each demand component, investment, consumption, government spending, each demand component has an import content. So if you do that, if you implement this policy, imports will grow faster than exports, which is fixed, yeah. You will experience a growing current account deficit, and you cannot finance that deficit through foreign borrowing. You cannot do that indefinitely. You can also not rely on the real exchange rate to adjust the balance of payments, and therefore you will have to constrain demand growth back to the balance of payments growth rate, and your inflationary finance policy will not work. So he discusses this. This is a main chapter in the book, and I also chip in this paper and elaborate on it a little bit more. How can you initially, in the initial stages, sustain demand growth above the balance of payments constrained growth rate, right? So that's the important question. So the only way in which you can do it, you cannot rely on the exchange rate or the real terms of trade to do the adjustment. You're going to have to rely in the initial stages on foreign capital inflows. I mean, which sounds contradictory, because the whole purpose of inflationary finance is you want to become less dependent on foreign resources. But unfortunately, you're going to still have to do that a little bit. Foreign borrowing could do the trick, but you have to be careful. That will involve interest payments and future debt obligations in scarce foreign currency. And you have this very important paper, interesting one by Cavallo et al. 2018, where they say it doesn't work. You cannot over-rely on foreign resources. It's a short-term thing, and you will run into foreign debt difficulties. The other thing that I mention is, what about FDI? Now, you see, a policy of inflationary finance, when you increase demand, that will keep capacity or resources fully employed, it will create a bit of inflation. What that will do is if you have a bit of inflation, the nominal or money rate of return of physical assets will increase relative to money assets. And that may itself, the demand and that higher rate of return on physicals may attract a more stable source of external finance like FDI. And I cite two papers here, published in two very good journals, Journal of International Economics and Review of Economic Studies, where they discuss the importance of demand, which is your inflationary finance policies, as a determinant of FDI. So maybe you can also look at that a little bit. How can you do that in the initial stages? Foreign aid in low-income countries. That's very controversial when you look at papers by Sachs, Easterly, and I don't know if you know the literature. This is a very interesting debate between Loff et al. And Herzer et al. 2015, published in World Development, the pros and cons of foreign aid. My overall review is that there's a growing literature which is actually showing that there's a positive effect of foreign aid on GDP per capita income, especially in sub-Saharan African countries and other low-income countries, not only on per capita income, but also other macro and micro-related areas. Very good paper by Juselius et al. Published in Oxford Bulletin of Economics and Statistics, where they look at African countries and they're more positive about foreign aid. The problem there sometimes is you're worried about the Dutch disease effect, foreign aid. When you look at one type of an exchange rate, one definition of an exchange rate, where you have the price of tradables relative to the price of non-tradables, the worry is you get foreign aid, it will generate a consumption boom, it will increase the price of non-tradables, financial services, et cetera, and your exchange rate will appreciate and undermine the competitiveness of manufacturing. So this paper by Ahmed et al. 2023, they're basically saying, they show that the Dutch disease effect is actually offset by interest payments. So African countries have foreign debt and they're using the foreign aid to repay foreign debt. And, so that mitigates the Dutch disease effect. The other thing that I mentioned, and they also hinted that, of course, you can use foreign aid to finance imports, capital intermediate goods, they're really productive, and also to finance the expenditure components of demand during the initial stages. So there's no need that there should be any downward pressure on your exchange rate. It shouldn't appreciate necessarily from foreign aid. Then over the medium run, so if you can do that, this is the initial stages. Remember, what you're doing with your inflationary finance, but you're generating capacity, and you're also generating capacity to export and to get around the balance of payments constraint. So if you can do that, you can use capital inflows to support your program during the initial stages. 10-to-1, your policy of inflationary finance will favorably affect the structural parameters of the balance of payments model. You will increase the income elasticity of demand for export, your goods will be more attractive for foreign consumers, and you will reduce your import propensity, the PI parameter. And the other thing that I mentioned, that would be, government infrastructure projects, investment in that through the inflation tax, that will all improve your export capacity. What that will also do is, it may also, over a medium term, it will lead to a depreciation in your real exchange rate, the price of tradables to non-tradables, because remember, the inflation tax and government spending on productive infrastructure projects, water supply, electricity supply, domestic transport, and so forth, will reduce the price of non-tradables. That will increase the relative profitability of tradables, and that will induce a further round of investments in the tradable sector, productive capital, R&D activities, and lead to a further improvement in the structural parameters of the balance of payment. So what you have here is the balance of payments growth rate can then adjust to the growth of demand, but you need to have that foreign capital inflows in the beginning to support that. That's very important. The cost of inflation, and I can assure you, I'm talking about all the benefits. Thirlwell's ISGD book, and as you can see, I quote him there, does not at all neglect the importance of, or the harmful, or serious harmful effects of excessive inflation. So you have to be careful. It's about mild inflation, not excessive inflation. Excessive inflation from the demand side or wherever can create serious balance of payments problems. As we've mentioned before, if one country is inflating at a much faster rate than another, high and variable prices can generate investment uncertainty. Investors will delay their investment decisions because investment is sunk cost and largely irreversible. It can create confusion between relative prices and aggregate prices and lead to a misallocation of resources. Savers investors could form different expectations about the ex-ante real interest rate, and that will also cause a misallocation of capital. So inflation cannot be excessive. What you get from the theory, and this is what I say there, is very important. Theory suggests a threshold inflation rate. Up until a point, the effect of inflation on growth will be positive. Beyond that threshold, the negative effects or the distortionary effects of inflation will dominate, right? So that's what you've got to get from the evidence. Then let's have a look at the evidence, kind of the early empirical evidence. So what I do there is I draw on very good surveys by Thirlwell in his ISGD book and a very, very good paper by Johnson published in 1984 where they survey previous studies. And, so to use Thirlwell's own words, when he summarizes the evidence, he says what evidence there is tends to be sketchy, impressionistic, and rather inconclusive. And so when you look at previous studies on inflation growth, you don't get a clear picture of the effect of inflation. His own work, Thirlwell's own work, when I refer to Thirlwell, his book, which is 74B, 74A is another paper he published in Journal of Development Studies, and another paper by Thirlwell and Barton. They also don't find good results when they look at the effect of inflation on investment, saving, and growth. They find a positive effect of inflation on investment, but only in developed countries. And I mean, this is all about inflationary finance in developing countries. And they only find a nonlinear effect in developed countries on growth, inflation on growth. So up until a certain point, inflation stimulates upward growth. Beyond that, the effect is negative. So what you can see there is inflationary finance irrelevant in developing countries? Based on their results, you can think so, but Thirlwell cautions against any hasty conclusions. They say, wait a bit, interpret the evidence. Why do we get these kind of rather disappointing results in the context of developing countries? First, you've got to remember, I repeat again, the growth benefits must come from demand inflation. So he mentions that. Then you will note that observed inflation is a composite of demand and structural inflation, right? So when you look at inflation, we don't know if it's demand, structural, cost push. It's a composite of all those sources of inflation. One type of inflation might dominate in a specific period, or it could change across periods. And if that happens, then cross-country evidence, time series evidence might be very disappointing results, because you want to look at the effect of demand inflation, but you cannot distinguish that from other types of inflation. And then to make it worse, if in your sample of cross-country studies, one country, it's demand inflation and other structural, you put them all together, you're going to get a mess. So you've got to take that into account. So Thirlwell's sample period and Thirlwell and Barton's sample period is from 58 to 68. It's a short sample period, isn't it? So perhaps in developing countries, the underlying cause of inflation is structural. So you get an insignificant effect. It's not demand. Maybe in the developed countries over that thing, it's demand inflation over those sub-periods. So what he's saying is what we should try and do is we should get longer data series over a longer time period to increase the probability that we can get more episodes where we have demand inflation and we have a better test. So that makes it really intriguing to see what we will get with more recent studies, where obviously they will have the advantage of a much larger sample. So the evidence, when I look at the evidence of more recent studies, I basically look at panel data studies since the early 90s. They use either GDP growth or per capita GDP growth as the dependent variable. Then, the early, what renewed interest, so, and this was Fisher's paper in 93 on inflation and growth. So it's a very good paper, but I also mentioned in the paper that his actual contribution is often misinterpreted by subsequent studies. When you look at Carnens and Hadji, for example, they wrote a very good paper in 2001, but they basically saying, well, Fisher's the first one to look at the nonlinear effect of inflation growth. That's not true, because if you go back to Thirlwell and even studies that they quote, previous studies in the 50s and 60s, you can see that is not true. Then they also attribute to Fisher the fact that he looks for nonlinearities. He's got a high inflation group of countries and a low inflation group of countries. and that he finds that at low inflation, the effect of inflation on growth is positive. He does not show that at all. I don't know where they get that from. Fisher emphasizes the negative effect of inflation on growth, and his so-called nonlinear story shows it's negative. Everywhere it's negative. There's no positive effect of inflation and growth. So just to set the record straight there. Two very good studies by Searle 96 and Gosh and Phillips, they do find thresholds of 8% and 2.5% respectively. The Searle study, again, just emphasizes the negative effect of growth because he doesn't find a positive effect of inflation on growth up until 8%. It's insignificant. Thereafter, it's negative and strongly negative. That's how he's still with a negative story. Gosh and Phillips, they identify a very low threshold of 2.5%. Up until 2.5%, the effect on inflation and growth is positive and significant. Thereafter, it's negative. But again, they emphasize the negative effect of inflation. The problem with the two studies is they do not distinguish between developed and developing countries. Something Thirlwell did way back, and that's very important to distinguish between them. Otherwise, your thresholds may not be accurate. So what I will show you here is some studies that have just looked at advanced countries. So they identify, so Khan and Senatje, Lopez and Mignon, 2011, Azam and Khan, 2022. When they just look at advanced countries, they get a threshold inflation of between 1% and 5.5%. Up until that threshold, the effect of inflation on growth in advanced countries is positive, thereafter is negative. So you can see it's already looking a little bit better in terms of showing the growth benefits of mild inflation. Now, you want to see what happens in developing countries. Remember Thirlwell's disappointing results, and this is what you get. So I categorize this under the developing countries. Studies tend to find thresholds varying between 9% and 19%, and I have a long list of studies. Up until the threshold, the inflation effect is positive and significant. Thereafter, it's negative. You can see, now that you have a longer data series, time series, you get more positive results in terms of the mild or the benefits of kind of mild inflation. And the reason is you can see the more comprehensive data sets in the more recent studies, they might provide kind of much stronger evidence, don't they? That some inflation may be beneficial in developing countries relative to so on, but that's already something that he mentioned before. We need longer data sets, longer time series to actually test this properly. Then the other thing I get from the results, studies that kind of unambiguous, beyond the thresholds, all of them, the effect of inflation on growth is negative and significant. So that's unambiguous. So that's also an important finding, because of course, whatever demand can be beneficial, but only up until a point. And thereafter, even demand inflation will have a negative effect. So there's no surprise. What is perhaps sometimes a little bit more ambiguous and more mixed is some studies show that for developing countries below a threshold of 10% to 17%, the effect is insignificant. Moshiri and Senatje, Espinosa, Creamer, Seleteng, and so on. So because now the problem is, I mean, I've already shown you the long list of studies that show a positive effect up until a threshold, but sometimes you do find studies showing an insignificant effect. That's what you have. So the high inflation thresholds that you find there, and sometimes the insignificant inflation thresholds. Why do we have that? Because if you go and read Thirlwell's ISGD book, because of the presence of structural and cost push inflation. Yes, thresholds will be higher because structural inflation is more prevalent in developing countries. Maybe sometimes you won't get it to be significant up until the threshold because structural inflation distorts the effect of demand inflation. Insights from inflation saving growth and development, Thirlwell's book. So the important point to make, the insignificant effect below the threshold does not mean that monetary policy can just be restrictive and there will be no cost involved, right? So if inflation below the threshold is insignificant, so I can easily bring it down from 17 to 5%. It's not costless because inflation perhaps is structural, is the unavoidable outcome of the growth and development process itself. And as I mentioned, to suppress structural inflation, if you use restrictive demand policy measures, would be to suppress growth. And studies don't always realize that. They think, oh, but the higher threshold in developing countries is because, again, poor institutions, the monetary transmission mechanism is not strong because of an underdeveloped banking system. True, that can be. The real reason why it is because of structural inflation. Yeah, if you go for the institutions view, you're going for the monetarist view. It's poor institutions, irresponsible macro policies, just bring it down. If you're a structuralist, you will understand that that high inflation threshold is a necessary part of the growth and development process. For you to bring inflation down without harming growth, you've got to look directly at the structural rigidities in agricultural sector, supply bottlenecks, foreign exchange shortages, and so on. You're not going to do it through restrictive macro policy. And then my last concluding sentence. So yeah, ISGD provides invaluable insights, as far as I'm concerned, to interpret the more recent evidence in a really theory consistent and policy relevant way. And that's my story. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Nel. I think that was so insightful. I think everybody in the session really benefited a lot. I would really like to not waste any time and open the floor up for questions, because I think there's so much insight into this and discussions. I think if we have a 5-hour session, it would not even be enough, because I think there's so much to talk about in terms of inflation and growth, which is so vital in developing countries. I would like to open the floor now for anyone with any questions for Professor Nel. You can either use the chat box, and I'll also share the link for the Facebook recording in the chat box for people who want to review afterwards, because I've got a few requests already for the recording because I find it so interesting. But I would just like to open the chat box now. And okay, let's see. I see that there's already a hand raised. Yes. Let me just check here. Okay. Okay, I see there's a hand raised from
Magda.
Yes. Yes, you can ask.
Thank you, Frederick. Thank you, Prof. Nel, for your very, very interesting presentation. For sure, we can listen for hours because there is just so much, and it's so interesting to me. And, you know, throughout the presentation, I couldn't help thinking about the case of South Africa and what are the implications of your research on South Africa. And I'm sure this is a question on many people's minds. Could you please comment on that? Thank you very much.
Okay. Shall I answer that now, Fred?
Yes, I think answer that one, and then we'll wait for a few more questions here in the chat box and Mike.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's fair to say that this is a very important question in South Africa, where, you know, we've looked at the inflation target of 3% to 6%, and, you know, we've wondered, and given all the challenges that we have in South Africa, if that is not perhaps too low and is not consistent with the structural features of the economy. So my view probably would be it is too low, and if we can go slightly higher. So as I mentioned in the paper as well, in emerging market economies, the debate typically is, you know, inflation targets of 3 to 5%, are they too low? Should we rather go for something like 6 to 8%? And I would tend to say that, you know, in South Africa, and what I know of South Africa is that perhaps we should be less conservative. The South African Reserve Bank looks at inflation almost as if it's a pure demand pull phenomenon. It's not, based on my own research. Our structural source of inflation in South Africa is a foreign exchange constraint. And, you know, I've said on various occasions that you should then allow some inflation to develop. Yeah, so that would be my view. You know, I don't know if we have any other views. I think, yeah, you know, the whole story about the monetary structural story, look at the South African Reserve Bank, like most central banks, I treat it as a pure demand pull inflation. In South Africa, it's not. small cost push, structural. So allow some inflation, and then look at those structural rigidities directly. What can you do to get around the foreign exchange constraint? You should go for, try and get, you should design policy measures to make sure that you have a more diversified export sector. That would be one of the things. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Thank you, Professor Nel, for the comment and the feedback. I see there's a few questions in the chat box. The first one is here from Jason P. regarding Prof. Nel, where could we maybe read further into this? So I would just want to ask if we can get some more information regarding that. And then also here, another question from Tsigatsu, which said that, I hope you're well. Why is restrictive monetary policy not the way to go if the economy is facing structural inflation? What would be the solution? I'm not sure if you want to maybe address those two issues. I would just like to also add one question from my side. I just like to ask about inflation being, we all know inflation is a phenomena of the poor and maybe a struggling middle class. So I think it's important to also talk about that when we talk about allowing for a bit of higher inflation, how we can then mitigate against the adverse effect it might have on the poor. We know inequality in South Africa is high. We know we're struggling with a struggling middle class and also a lot of people in poverty. So I think that's also something to maybe just touch on, which will be very interesting, Prof. And then there's another question from Witness. I'm not sure if you want to take that one or you want to maybe address.
Yeah, let me, or else I will forget. So
yes, yes.
I think, okay, so the first question by Jason, is it? Where can we get more on this? Well, you can contact me because I mean, you know, I've written a paper on all this and, you know, I've all the references and everything. So that could be a good place to start. But I would also suggest that you get Thurwell's book, which is a very interesting read. You know, so I mean, what I do in this paper, I review the book, but I also update it as you get from the presentation more recent evidence, for example. So contact me if you'd like to, and I can, you know, then refer you to, can maybe give you my own paper and other references as well. Then the story about why will restrictive monetary policy not work when we have structural inflation? I think I gave a good example there to answer that question. A paper published in 2020 in economic modeling by Bhattacharjee and Jain, if I'm pronouncing that surname correctly. And they actually look at this, you know, so type of structural inflation where you have an increase in the price of food. So what they look at is they look at how did advanced economies, you know, central banks in advanced countries respond to that? Well, they implemented restrictive monetary policy to stem food inflation, and that didn't work. That actually increased overall inflation and it reduced output growth, a recession. It didn't work because the cause of inflation is not on the demand side, it's on the structural side. So that is the implication, that you cannot try and address structural inflation through demand-side policy measures. You make the situation worse. You do that, you increase production costs as well through your interest rate policy. And then they also show, when you look at emerging market economies, what did they do in response to food inflation? Well, the monetary policy transmission mechanism is not significant in emerging market economies. And my explanation of probably is they were less aggressive in their policy responses because emerging market economies would be more careful compared perhaps with advanced countries that have social safety nets and those things to take care of their restrictive monetary policy measures, where you don't have that in emerging market economies. You should address the underlying cause of inflation. You should not try and do it through the demand side, which is, I mean, inflation doesn't originate from the demand side. Fred, you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, so one's always got to be really careful. And if I go to one of the models, like the Kaldor-Thurwell model, you know, one gets worried because you're talking about a reduction in real wages and you're redistributing income from wage earners to profit earners. That is all about mild inflation, and it will only be relevant in certain types of economies, underdeveloped economies. The positive thing that you can do there is to try and address the inequality thing is you're trying to do something good, because you're trying to generate a faster rate of capital accumulation, and that may reduce structural unemployment, and take care of the kind of situation in that sense. But yes, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I mean, you cannot have excessive inflation, otherwise the poor will inevitably will suffer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. No, thank you for that response. I think, again, this theory really builds on that capital accumulation and fast-tracking that process, and then the poor will be lifted out of poverty via the economic development, if I'm not mistaken. But I would just like to give Witness the last question, because we've run out of time, unfortunately. So, like I said, it's a 5-hour discussion, this, but so interesting. But Witness, you have the floor for the last question. I'm not sure. Witness, your hand is raised.
Just unmute, perhaps.
Yes, I see he's unmuted, but I'm not sure. Like, we can't hear anything. Yes, I can hear.
Sorry, I think I was frozen, so I couldn't hear. My apologies for that. Thank you, Prof, for an interesting talk. My name is Witness. So I have sort of two short questions and sort of slash comments. So the first one is, so you make the argument that in this particular cycle round of inflation, advanced economies raised interest rates sharply, but inflation was largely due to supply side issues. I'm not sure I totally agree with that. I do think that demand was a big factor in some advanced economies, because we know that during the pandemic, there was a lot of fiscal spending, and the monies that people were given were not spent. So there was quite a bit of spending there. And if you look at your inflation trajectories, I think you can see that goods inflation was quite high in 2022. Of course, now it's coming down, partly because of the monetary policy effects. So I would like you to comment on that if you could. Then the second thing for me is that one of the challenges I think that people, so let's say central bankers face, is that, yeah, so you can argue that, well, it's supply side inflation, but actually part of the problem is that inflation is becoming embedded into the system, even if it's due to food. If you allow inflation to fester for long, then of course it's going to feed into wage demands. And of course, companies will start pushing prices higher because they want to preserve their margins. So not doing anything because it's a supply side inflation, I'm not persuaded that that is a good point or argument to make. Then lastly, I think probably I would be worried if inflation up to 17% can be considered modest inflation. It's true if you are coming out of a hyperinflationary environment, but I don't think, for the same reason that Frederick mentioned, if you allow inflation to run at 17% per annum, surely you are really squeezing badly the people who are living on fixed incomes. So for me, that's not modest inflation. So I would like to hear sort of your views on that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you. You make some very, very interesting points there. You work at the South African Reserve Bank, Witness?
I do.
Yes, okay, yes, okay, I know, I got that. Let me start off with your story about the issue in advanced economies. Yes, you're absolutely right. That is the monetary structuralist debate, isn't it? Because there is, I mean, you do have some views, and I know Greg Mankiw, for example, he's also saying, you know, there was excessive expenditure and too much COVID relief, and that generated excess demand. And perhaps that is a cause of inflation. That is perhaps somewhat, to some extent, it's true, but I would rather go, you know, so I'm not ruling out the demand side story, and that shows you how important the debate is, but I would still think it is more about supply side bottlenecks related, that dominates. You know, the COVID pandemic, rigidities in the transport sector, and you have to, supply side bottlenecks means you've just got to allow inflation to go, and then that will ensure that resources are reallocated, and it will eventually squeeze inflation out of the system. And the same with, you know, the war in Ukraine, energy prices, food prices, they go up, and, you know, so, you know, I hear what you're saying about demand, but I think it's more of a structural and cost push source. I think they dominate. And I think, yes, you're right about 17% inflation, whether you should regard that as modest or not. But remember, what you see when you look at the thresholds, you see two types of inflation. You see demand inflation, and superimposed on that, you see structural and cost push inflation, because they go together. And so you've got to take into account that. I mean, so what you have in that, and demand inflation is perhaps modest, let's say up until 5-6%, but when you add another 6-7% because of structural and cost push inflation, it's much higher. So yes, it doesn't become modest then, but the modest part in that inflation is the demand inflation, which is probably much lower than what you see in the 17%. Then your story about the food inflation and the wage price spiral, because I know central banks do fear that, right? So you have an increase in food prices. You're worried if you just leave it alone, it will generate a wage price spiral and inflation will accelerate and central banks won't be able to control it. But that will also depend on the situation in the labor market. If the labor market is tight, you have a very low unemployment rate, and then maybe you will have a wage price spiral. But if you have a very high unemployment rate, and so on, then the wage price spiral and the fear of central banks that would trigger accelerating inflation perhaps will not materialize if you have a high unemployment rate in that sense. So those are my answers. Thank you very much, Witness, for your interesting questions.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Witness. Thank you, Prof. Now, I would just like to, I think it's time for us to conclude this meeting because, like I said, I think we can talk for 5 hours straight on this. It's such an interesting topic, and I think it's such a good debate to have in South Africa, in the South African context. And Professor Nel, I just want to say thank you very much from our side again, the EDWRG and the School of Economics, to have you presenting here. We know also the input you give to students, and every student that comes to my office always tells me how good lecturer you are and to really how you explain these concepts. And I think today even I just saw proof of that, just the way you explain everything. And I think there's such an interesting discussion here. So thank you very much, and we really appreciate it. The link will be available for anyone who wants it. I'll put my email address here in the chat box. So please email me if you want the link to the session. I've also emailed, or I put a link to our Facebook video in the chat box. So please just copy the link if you want it. But I just want to say thank you very much, Prof, for your presentation. And also to all the participants, thank you very much. We really appreciate you joining us. Keep up to date. We'll keep you up to date about future presentations. And Professor Nel, thank you very much for your contribution here today.
Thank you very much, Fred, and thank you very much, everyone, for attending and for some really interesting questions. Thanks. You all take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. You're now welcome to leave. Thank you.